Well, good evening, everyone. Look at y'all here. Just like regular, y'all showed up and can hang around this fire. You know, it's good even in the summer. It's not that cold at night anymore, it's only down into the high 40s. But it sure is nice. Watch the flames dancing and have this drink in my hand and seeing y'all come together and enjoying the company. And so what we ought to do is tell stories. That's kind of the natural progression. Well, the story I want to tell you tonight is a little more of that book, The Untamed. Well, we're on book 2. You remember Ginger found another book by Max Brand. So y'all just get settled in and we'll start reading. I'll begin with chapter 13. It's titled The Three. Well, the whistling came from behind the hotel, and although it ended as soon as he reached the veranda of the building, Buck Daniels hurried to the rear of the place. There were the long, low sheds of the barn, and behind these, he knew, must be the corrals. He raced around the corner of the shed, and there came to a halt, for he saw a thing that turned his blood to ice. One of those rare rains in the mountain desert had recently fallen, and the corrals behind the barn were carpeted with a short, thick grass. In the small corral nearest him, he beheld, rolling on that carpet of grass, a great wolf, or a dog as large and as rough-coated as a wolf, and a man, and they were engaged in a desperate and silent struggle for mastery. Their movements were so lightning fast that Buck Daniels could not make out distinct forms from the tangle. But he saw the great white teeth of the wolf flash in the sun one instant, and the next the man had whirled on top. It was Dan and Bart at play. No outcry from Dan, no growl from the wolf. Buck felt the old chill which never left him when he saw the fierce game of the wolf and the wolf man. All this passed in the twinkling of an eye. And then Dan, by a prodigious effort, had thrown the great beast away from him so that Bart fell upon its back. Dan leaped with outstretched arms upon the fallen animal and buried his clutching hands in the throat of the beast. Yet still there was a thrill to add to these, for now a black horse appeared in the picture, a miracle of slender, shimmering grace, and he rushed with flattened ears upon the two twisting, writhing, prostrate figures. His teeth were bared. He was more like a prodigious dog than a horse, and these teeth closed on the back of the man's neck. Or did they merely pinch his shirt? And then Dan was dragged bodily away from the wolf and thrown through the air by a flirt of the stallion's head. Horrible! Buck Daniels shuddered and then grinned shamefacedly in apology to himself. The three of 'em, he grunted, stepped closer to the fence to watch. The instant the man was torn away by the intersection of the horse, the wolf regained its feet and rushed upon him. But Dan had landed from his fall upon his feet with cat-like agility, and now he dodged the rush of the wolf and the arrowy spring of the creature and sprang, in his turn, towards the stallion. The black met this attack by rearing, his ears flattened and his teeth bared, his eyes terrible to behold. As the man raced close, the stallion struck with lightning hoof, but the blow failed of its mark by the breadth of a hair, and the assailant, swerving like a will-o'-the-wisp, darted to the side of the animal and leapt upon its back. At the same instant, the wolf left the ground with terrible gaping mouth in a spring for the rider, but Dan flattened himself along the shining back of his mount, and the wolf just catapulted harmlessly past. After this failure, the wolf dog seemed to desire no further active part in the struggle, but took up a position to one side, and there, with lolling tongue and red-stained eyes, watched the battle continue. The stallion, to be sure, kept up with the conflict with a wholehearted energy. Never had Buck Daniels in a long and varied career seen such wild pitching. The black leaped here and there, doubling about with the sinuous speed of a snake, springing high in the air in one instant and landing the next on stiff legs, dropping to the ground the next second, and rolling to crush the rider, up again like a leaf jerked up by a gale of wind, and so on the fierce struggle continued. with the wild rider slapping the neck of the horse as if it would encourage it to be more terrible, and drumming its round barrel with vindictive heels. His hair flew back, his face flushed, and in his eyes there was the joy of the sailor, long landbound, who climbs at last the tallest mast and feels its pitch beneath him and catches the sharp tang of the traveled wind. The struggle ceased as if in obedience to an inaudible command. From the full frenzy of motion, horse and man were suddenly motionless. Then Dan slipped from his seat and stood before his mount. At once the ears of the stallion, which had been flat back, pricked sharply forward. The eyes of the animal grew luminous and soft as the eyes of a woman, and he dropped the black velvet of his muzzle beneath his master's chin. As for Dan Barry, he rewarded this outburst of affection with no touch of his hand, but his lips moved, and he seemed to be whispering a secret to his horse. The wolf in the meantime had viewed this scene with growing unrest, and now it trotted up and placed itself at the side of the man. Receiving no attention in this position, it caught the arm of the man between its great fangs and drew his hand down to him. The stallion, angered by this interruption, raised a delicate forefoot to strike, and was received with a terrific snarl, the first sound of the entire scene. "Bart," said the man, and his voice was not raised or harsh, but came as softly as running water. "If you ain't going to be a gentleman, I gots to teach you manners. Get up on Satan's back and lie down till I tell you to get off." The wolf received this command with a snarl even more blood-curdling than before, but he obeyed, slinking sidewise a reluctant pace or two, and then springing to the back of the stallion with a single bound. There he crouched, still snarling softly until his master raised a significant forefinger. At that, he lowered his head and maintained a fiercely observant silence. "Dan," called Buck Daniels, the other world. "Speaking of pets," observed Buck Daniels, "I heard tell once about a gent that had a tame lion, which you got the outbeatenest pair I ever seen, Dan. Gentle, ain't they? Like a stampede of cows?" But Barry left this remark unanswered. He ran to the tall fence, placed his hand on the top rail, and vaulted lightly over it. Then he grabbed the hand of the larger man, and his face lighted. "Buck," he said, "I've been sort of lonesome. It feels pretty good to see you again." "Oh, man," answered Buck Daniel, "speaking of being lonesome." He checked himself. "How about stepping inside and having a talk?" The other started forward agreeably, but stopped almost at once. "Heel," he called without turning his head. Black Bart left the back of the stallion in a long bound that carried him halfway to the fence. The next leap brought him over the rail and beside his master. Buck Daniels moved back a step involuntarily. "Bart," he said, "do you know me?" He stretched out his hand and was received with a sudden baring of the fangs. "Nice dog," said Buck sarcastically. "Regular house pet, ain't he?" The other apparently missed the entire point of this remark. He said, in his gentle, serious way, "He used to be real wild, Buck, but now he don't mind people. He let the cook feed him a chunk of meat the other day, and, well, you remember he don't usually touch stuff that other men have handled." "Yep," grunted Buck. "It's sure disgusting to have a dog as tame as that. I bet he ain't killed another dog for a whole day, maybe." And still Barry saw no irony in this. He answered, as gravely as before, "No, it was the day before yesterday. Somebody came to town and got drunk. He had 2 dogs and he sicked 'em on Bart." Buck Daniels controlled an incipient shudder. "Both dead?" "Well, I was inside the house," said Dan sadly, "and it took me a couple of seconds to get outside. Of course, by that time, Bart had cut their throats." "Of course. Didn't the drunk guy try to pot Bart?" "Yeah, he got out his gun, but Mr. O'Brien, the bartender, persuaded him out of it. I was glad there wasn't no trouble." "My God!" exclaimed Buck Daniels, and then, "Well, let's go inside. We'll take your man-eater along if you want to." A shadow came in the eyes of Barry. Can we talk just as well out here?" "Well, what's the matter of finding some chairs?" Because I don't like to go inside walls. You know how four walls seem like so many pairs of eyes standing around you? No, said Buck bluntly, I don't know nothing of the kind. What do you mean? I don't know, answered Barry, depressed. It just seemed that way. Ain't you noticed how sort of close up it is in a house? Kind of hard to breathe? Like you had on a shirt too small for you? Well, we'll stay out here then. The other nodded, smiled, and made a gesture to the dog beside him. Black Bart crouched on the ground, and Dan Barry sat down cross-legged, his shoulders leaning against that shaggy pelt of Bart. Daniels followed the example with less grace. He was thinking very hard and fast, and he rolled a Durham cigarette to fill the interlude. I suppose you're busting to find out the news about the folks, he said dryly at last. The other sat with his hands loosely in his lap. His wide eyes looked far away. And there was about his lips that looseness, that lack of compression, which one sees so often in children. He might have sat in that posture for the statue of thoughtlessness. What folks? He asked at last. Buck Daniels had lighted a match, and now he was staring blank until the match burned down to his fingers. With an oath, he tossed the remnant away and he lighted another. He had drawn down several long breaths of smoke to the bottom of his lungs before he could speak again. Some people you used to know. I suppose you've forgotten all about 'em, eh? His eyes narrowed. There was a spark of something akin to dread in them. Kate Cumberland? He queried. A light came into the face of Dan Barry. Kate Cumberland, he repeated. How is she, Buck? Lately I've been a-thinking about her every day. A trembling took the body and the voice of Daniels. His errand, after all, might meet some success. Kate, he repeated. Oh, she's well enough, but old Joe Cumberland ain't. No? He's dying, Dan. And Dan replied calmly, he's kind of old, I suppose. Old, said Buck with a sort of horror. Yeah, he's old right enough. Do you know why he's dying? It's 'cause you went away the way you done, Dan. That's what's a-killing him. Something of thought came into the face of Barry. Maybe I understand, he said slowly. If I was to lose Satan or Bart... Here the great dog whined at the mention of his name, and Barry dropped a slender hand across the scarred forehead of his servant. If I was to lose him, I'd sort of mourn for him, maybe. Buck Daniels set his teeth. I don't suppose it seems possible, he said, that a man could miss another man the way you could miss your dog, eh? But it is. Joe Cumberland is dying for you, Dan, as sure as you put a bullet in his bowels. The other hesitated, and then frowned and made a gesture of vague dismissal. Don't you figure on doing nothing about it? Asked Buck softly. Well, what could I do? My God Almighty, ain't you got no human feelings? I don't know what you mean, said the soft voice. This. Can't you get on your hoss and ride back with me to the Cumberland Ranch? Stay with the old man till he gets back on his feet? Ain't that easy you to do? Is your time so damn valuable that you can't spare a few days for that? But I am going back, answered Dan in a rather hurt voice. They ain't no need for cussing me, Buck. I've been thinking of Kate every day almost. Since when? I don't know. Dan stirred uneasily. He looked up, and far above Buck, following the direction of Dan's eyes, he saw a pattern of wild geese. I've been sort of drifting north towards the Cumberland Ranch, and Kate, went on Dan. He sighed. I've been thinking of her eyes, which is blue, Buck, and her hair, and the soft sound of her voice. They've been hanging in my ears and staying behind my eyes lately, and I've been drifting up that way steady. Why, man, cried Buck, then what's there to keep you here? Jump on your hoss and we'll head north in 10 minutes. I will, said Dan, full as eagerly. We'll start full speed. Well, come on then. Wait a minute, said Dan, his voice growing suddenly cold. I've been forgetting something. Buck Daniels turned and found his companion strangely changed. There was a set expression of coldness about his eyes and a chill glitter in them. I got to wait here for something. Well, what's that? Well, there's a man in town that may want to see me. Mac Strand? I heard about him, Dan. Are you going to let Joe Cumberland die because you want to stay here and fight it out with a dirty cutthroat? I don't want to fight, protested Barry. No, there ain't nothing I like less than fighting. Buck Daniel cursed softly and continuously to himself. Dan, he said, can you sit there and lie like that to me? Ain't I seen you in action? Don't I remember the way you trailed Jim Silent? Don't I remember how we all got down and prayed you to keep away from Jim? Don't I remember how you threw everything to hell so's you could get your hands on Jim? My God Almighty, man, didn't I see your face when you had your finger in Silent's throat? An expression of unutterable revulsion rippled over the face of Dan Barry. Stop, he commanded softly and raised his slender hand. Don't keep on talking about it. It makes me sick, all through. Ah, Buck, there's a tingle in the tips of my fingers still from the time I had 'em in his throat. And it makes me feel unclean. The sort of uncleanness that won't wash out with no kind of soap and water. Buck, I'd most rather die myself than fight a man. A vast amazement overspread the countenance of Buck Daniels as he listened to this outburst. It was as if he'd heard a healthy man proclaim that he had no desire for bread and meat. Something rose to his lips, but he swallowed it. Then it looks kind of simple to me, he said. You hate fighting. This gent Mac Strand likes it. He lives on it. He don't do nothing but wait from day to day hungering for a scrap. What's the out? Just this. You hop on your hoss and you ride out with me. Young Jerry Strand kicks out. Mac Strand starts looking for you, and he hears that you've beat it. He goes off and forgets about it. Ain't that simple? The old uneasiness returned to the far-seeing eyes of Dan Barry. I don't know, he said, maybe. Then he paused again. Have you got anything to say agin it? Urged Buck, arguing desperately. I don't know, repeated Barry, confused, except that I keep thinking what a terrible disappointment it'll be to this Mac Strand when his brother dies and I ain't around. Buck Daniels stared, blinked, and then burst into unmelodious laughter. Satan trotted across the corral and raised his head above the fence, whinnying softly. Barry turned his head and smiled up to the horse. Then he said, Seems like if Jerry Strand dies, I owe somebody something. Who? Mac Strand, I reckon. I sort of got to stay and give him his chance. I hope to God, burst out Daniel, smashing his hands together, that Mac Strand beat you to a pulp. That's what I hope. The eyes of Dan Barry widened. Well, why do you hope that? It brought Daniels again to speechlessness. Is it possible, he growled to himself? Are you a human being, and yet you think more of your hoss and your damned wolf dog than you do to the life of a man? Dan, I'm asking you straight, is that a square thing to do? The fragile hands went out to him, palm up. Don't you see, Buck? I don't want to be this way. I just can't help it. Then the Lord help poor Joe Cumberland and him that took you in out of the desert and him that raised you from the time you was a kid and, well, him that nursed you back like you was his own baby and him that loved you more than he loved Kate and, well, him that was lying back there now with fire in his eyes, waiting for you to come back, Dan. And if you was to see him, you'd go down on your knees and ask him to forgive you. I suppose I would, murmured Barry thoughtfully. Dan, you're going to go back with me. I don't somehow think it's my time for moving, Buck. Is that all you got to say to me? Well, I guess maybe it is, Buck. If I was to beg you to come for old time's sake and all we've been through together, you and me, wouldn't it make no difference to you? The large, gentle eyes focused far beyond Buck Daniels, somewhere on a point in the pale, hazy blue of the spring sky. I'm kind of tired of talking, Buck, he said at length. And Buck Daniels rose, and walked slowly away with his head fallen. Behind him the stallion neighed suddenly and loud, and it was so much like a blast of defiant triumph that Buck whirled and shook his clenched fist at Satan. Chapter 14, Music for Old Nick. A thought is like a spur. It lifts the head of a man, and the spur makes the horse toss his, and it quickens the pace with a subtle addition of strength. Such a thought came to Buck Daniels as he stepped again on the veranda of the hotel. It could not have been an altogether pleasant inspiration, for it drained the color from his face and made him clench his broad hands. And next he loosened his revolver in its holster. A thought of fighting, of some desperate chance he had once taken, perhaps. But also it was a thought which needed considerable thought. He slumped into a wicker chair at one end of the porch and sat with his chin resting on his chest while he smoked cigarette after cigarette and tossed the butts idly over the rail. More than once he pressed his hands against his lips as though there were sudden pains there. The color did not come back to his face. It continued as bloodless as ever. But there was a ponderable light in his eyes, and his jaws became more and more firmly set. It was not a pleasant face to watch at that moment, for he seemed to sit with a growing resolve. Long moments passed before he moved a muscle. But then he heard, far away, thin and clear, whistling from behind the hotel. It was no recognizable tune. It was rather a strange improvisation, with singable fragments here and there, and then wild free runs and trills. It was as if some bird of exquisite singing powers should be taken in a rapture of song, so that it whistled snatches here and there of its usual melody. But all between were great, wholehearted rhapsodies. As the sound of this whistling came to him, Buck raised his head suddenly, and finally, still listening, he rose to his feet and turned into the dining room. There he found the waitress he had met before and asked her for the name of the doctor who took care of the wounded Jerry Strawn. "Well, there ain't no doc," said the waitress. "It's Fatty Matthews, the deputy marshal, who takes care of that Strawn. Bad luck to him. Fatty's in the barroom now, but what's the matter? You seem like you was hearing something." "I am," replied Daniels. "I'm hearing something that would be music for the ears of old Nick." And he turned on his heel and strode for the barroom. There's where he found Fatty in the very act of disposing of a stiff 3 fingers of red eye. Daniels stepped to the bar, poured his own drink, and then stood toying with the glass. For though the effect of red eye may be pleasant enough, it has an essence which appals the stoutest heart and singes the most leathery throat. It is to full-grown men what castor oil is to a child. Why men drink it is a mystery whose secret is known only to the profound soul of the mountain desert. But while Daniels fingered his glass, he kept an eye upon the other man at the bar. It was unquestionably the one he sought. The excess flesh of the deputy marshal would have brought his nickname to the mind of an imbecile. However, Fatty was humming softly to himself, and it is not the habit of men who treat very sick patients to sing. "I'll hit it again," said Fatty. "I need it." "Have a bad time of it today?" asked O'Brien sympathetically. "Bad time today? Yep, and every day is the same. I tell you, O'Brien, it takes a pile of nerve to stand around that room expecting Jerry to pass out any minute, and the eyes of that devil Mac Strand are following you every step you make. Do you know, if Jerry dies, I figure Mac to go to my throat like a bulldog." "Well, you're wrong, Fatty," replied O'Brien. "That ain't his way about it. He takes his time killing a man. Wait till he can get him in a public place and makes him start the picture. That's Mac Strand. You remember Fitzpatrick? Mac Strand followed Fitz nigh into 2 months, but Fitz knew what was up and he never would make a move. He knowed that if he made a wrong pass, it'd be his last. So he took everything and let it pass by. But finally it got on his nerves. One time, well, it was right here in my barroom, Fatty." "The hell you say?" "Yep, that was before your time around these parts. But Fitz had a couple of jolts of red-eye under his vest and felt pretty strong. Now Mac Strand happened in, and first thing you know, they was at it. Well, Fitz is a big man. I ain't small, but I had to look up when I talked to Fitz. Scotch-Irish, and they got fighting bred into their bone. Now Mac Strand passed him a look, and Fitz came back with a word. Soon as he got started, he couldn't stop. It wasn't a pretty thing to watch either. You could see in Fitz's face that he knew he was done for afore he started. But he wouldn't let up. The booze had him going, and he was too proud to back down. Pretty soon he started cussing Mac Strand. Well, by that time everybody had cleared out of the saloon, 'cause they knowed them sort of words meant some bullets coming next. But Mac Strand just stood there watching and grinning in his ugly way, damn his soul black, and never saying a word back. By God, Fatty, he looked sort of hungry, and when he grinned, his upper lip went up kind of slow and you could see his big teeth. I expected to see him make a move, sink him in the throat of Fitz, but he didn't. Nope, he didn't make a move. And all the time Fitz a raving and getting worse and worse, and finally Fitz made the move. Yep, he pulled his gun and had it damn near clean on Mac Strand before that devil could stir. But when he did, it was just a flash of light. Both them guns went off, but Mac's bullet hits Fitz's hand and knocks the gun out of it. So, of course, his shot went wild. But Fitz could see his own blood, and you know what that does to the Scotch-Irish. Makes some people quit cold to see their own blood. Why, see, I remember a kid at school that was a whale at fighting till his nose got to bleeding or something, and then he'd just quit cold. But you take a Scotch-Irishman, and it works just the opposite. Show him his own color, and he goes plumb crazy. And that's what happened to Fitz. When he saw that blood on his hand, he made a dive at Mac Strand. After that, it wasn't the sort of thing that makes a good story. Mac Strand got him around the ribs, and I heard the bones crack. God. And him still squeezing, and Fitz beating away at Mac's face with his bleeding hand. Will you believe that I stood there and just sort of froze? Yes, Fatty, I couldn't make a move. And I sort of sick and hollow inside. Then I heard the breath of Fitz coming hoarse and with a rattle in it. And I heard Mac Strand whining like a dog that's tasted blood and starving for more. A thing to make your hair go up on end, like they say in the storybooks. Well, then Fitz, he was plumb mad. He tried to bite Mac Strand, and then Mac let go of him and set his hands on the throat of Fitz. Happened like a flash, and I'm here to swear that I could hear the bones crunch. And then Fitz's mouth sagged open and his eyes rolled up to the ceiling, and Mac Strand just threw him down on the floor, just like that. Damn him. And then he stood over poor dead Fitz and kicked him in those busted ribs, and turned over to the bar and says to me, "Gimme," like a damn beast. He wanted to drink right there with his dead man beside him. And what was worse, I had to give him the bottle. There was a sort of haze in front of my eyes. I wanted to pump that devil full of lead, but I knowed it was plain suicide to try it. So there he stood and ups with a glass that was brimming full, and downs it at a swallow, gurgling like a hog. Fatty, how long will it be before there's an end to Mac Strand? But Fatty Matthews shrugged his thick shoulders and poured himself another drink. There ain't a hope for Jerry Strawn? Cut in Buck Daniels. Not one in a million, coughed Fatty, disposing of another formidable potion. And when Jerry dies, Mac starts for this Barry, right? Who's been telling you? Queried O'Brien dryly. Maybe you've been reading minds, stranger. Buck Daniels regarded the bartender with a mild and steadfast interest. He was smiling with the utmost good humor, but there was that about him which makes a big O'Brien flush and look down to his array of glasses behind the bar. I've been wondering, went on Daniels, if Mac Strand mightn't come out with Barry about the same way Jerry did. Ain't it possible? No, replied Fatty Matthews with a calm decision. It ain't possible. Well, I'm due back in my bear cage. You ought to look in on me, O'Brien, and see that mountain lion dying and the grizzly looking on. Will it last long? Queried O'Brien. Somewheres about this evening. Here Daniel snorted violently and closed his hand around his whiskey glass, which had not raised yet toward his lips. Are you sure of that, Marshal? He said. If Jerry's held on this long, ain't there a chance that he'll hold on longer? Can you date him for up to tonight, as sure as that? I can, said the deputy marshal. That ain't hard when you seen as many go west as I seen. It ain't harder than it is to tell when the sand'll be out of an hourglass. When they've been going down the last hill, it ain't hard to tell when they'll reach the bottom. Ain't you had anybody to spell you Fatty? Broke in O'Brien. Yep, I got Haw-Haw Langley up there, but he ain't much help. Just sits around with his hands all folded up. Looks kind of like Haw-Haw wanted Jerry to pass out. And Matthews went humming through the swinging doors. Chapter 15. Old Gary Peters. Now, for some moments after this, Buck Daniels remained at the bar with his hand clenched around his glass and his eyes fixed before him in this peculiar second-sighted manner which had marked him when he sat for so long on the veranda. "Funny thing," began O'Brien to make conversation. "How many fellers go west at sunset? Seems like they go all holts as soon as the dark comes, hey?" "How long before sunset now?" asked Buck Daniels sharply. "Maybe a couple hours." "A couple of hours," repeated Daniels, and ground his knuckles across his forehead. "A couple of hours." He raised his glass with a jerky motion and downed the contents. The chaser stood disregarded before him, and O'Brien regarded his patron with an eye of admiration. "You long for these parts?" he asked. "No, I'm strange to this range. Riding up north pretty soon if I can get somebody to tell me the lay of the land. Do you know it?" "Never been further north than Brownsville." "Couldn't name me someone that's traveled about, I suppose?" "Well, old Gary Peters knows every rock within 3 days' riding. He keeps a blacksmith shop across the way." "So, thanks, I'll look him up." Buck Daniels found the blacksmith seated on a box before his place of business. It was a slack time for Gary Peters, and he consoled himself for idleness by chewing the stem of an unlighted corncob, whose bowl was upside down. His head was pulled down and forward as if by the weight of his prodigious sandy mustache, and he regarded the vague horizon with misty eyes. "Seen you coming out of O'Brien's," said the blacksmith as Buck took possession of a nearby box. "What's the news?" "Ain't any news," responded Buck dejectedly. "Too much talk, no news." "That's right," nodded Gary Peters. "O'Brien is the out-talkingest man I ever see. Ain't nobody on Brownsville can get his tongue around so many words as O'Brien." So saying, he blew through his pipe, picked up a stick of soft pine, and began to whittle it down to a point. "In my part of the country," went on Buck Daniels, "they don't lay much by a man that talks a pile." Here the blacksmith turned his head slowly, regarded his companion for an instant, then resumed his whittling. "But," said Daniels with a sigh, "if I could find a man that knowed the country north of Brownsville and had a hobble on his tongue, I could give him a night's work what'd be worthwhile." And Gary Peters removed his pipe from his mouth and blew out a breath. He turned one wistful glance upon his idle forge. He turned a sadder eye upon his companion. "I could name you a silent man or two in Brownsville," he said, "but there ain't only what one man knows the country right." "That's so. And who might that be?" "Oh, me." "You?" echoed Daniels in surprise. He turned and considered Gary as if for the first time. "Maybe you know the lay of the land up as far as Hawkins Arroyo?" "Me? Ha! Son, I know every cactus clear to Bald Eagle." Muttered Daniels. "I suppose maybe you could name some of the outfits from here on a line with Bald Eagle. Say you put 'em 10 miles apart." "Nothing easier. I could find 'em blindfold. First due out these McCaulleys, then lay a bit west and north and you hit the Circle K bar. That's about 12 miles from McCaulleys. Hit her up dead north again by east and you come 8 miles to the Three Roads. You go on to—" "Partner," cut in Daniels, "I could do business with you." "Well, maybe you could." "My name's Daniels. I'm Gary Peters. How are you?" They shook hands. "Peters," said Buck Daniels, "you look square. I need you in a square game, but there ain't any questions that go with it. 20 iron men for 1 day's riding and 1 day's silence." "My friend," murmured Peters, "in my day I've gone 3 months without a speaking to anything in boots, and I wasn't hired for it neither." "You know them people up the line?" said Daniels. "Do they know you?" "I'll tell a man they do. Know Gary Peters?" "Partner, this is what I want. I want you to leave Brownsville inside of 10 minutes and start riding for Elkhead. I want you to ride, and I want you to ride like hell. Every 10 miles or so, I want you to stop at some place where you can get a fresh hoss. Get your fresh hoss and leave the one you've got off, and tell 'em to have that hoss you leave ready for me any time tonight. And it'll take you clear till tomorrow night to reach Elkhead, even with relaying your hosses. Round about that, if I ride like hell, what do I take with me? Nothing. Nothing but the coin I give you to hire someone at every stop to have that hoss you've left ready for me. Better still, if you can have 'em, get a fresh hoss. Would they trust you with hosses that way, Gary? You give me the coin, and where they don't trust me, I'll pay cash. I can do it. It'll about bust me, but I can do it. You going to try for a record between Brownsville and Elkhead, huh? You got a bet up, huh? The biggest bet you ever heard of, said Daniels grimly. You can tell them boys along the road that I'm trying for a time. Have you got a fast hoss to start with? I got a red mare that ain't much for running cattle, but she's greased lightning for a short bust. Then get her out, saddle her up, and be on your way. Now here's my stake. I'll keep back 120 for accidents. First, give me a list of the places you'll stop for the relays. He produced an old envelope and a stub of soft pencil, with which he jotted down Gary Peters' directions. And every second, said Buck Daniels in parting, that you can cut off your own time will be cutting them off of mine, because I'm liable to be on your heels when you ride into Elkhead. Well, Gary Peters lifted his eyebrows and then restored his pipe. He spoke through his teeth. You ain't got a piece of money to bet on that, partner? He queried softly. 10 extra if you get to Elkhead afore me. They's limits to hoss flesh, remarked Peters. What time you riding against? Against a cross between a bullet and a nor'easter, Gary. I'm going back to drink at your luck. A promise which Buck Daniels fulfilled, for he had had need of even borrowed strength. He drank steadily until a rattle of hoofs down the street entered the saloon, and if someone came in to say that Gary Peters had started out of town to beat all hell on his red mare. After that, Buck started out to find Dan Barry. His quarry was not in the barn nor in the corral behind the barn. There stood Satan and Black Bart, but their owner was not in sight. But a thought came to Buck while he looked rather mournfully at the stallion's promise of limitless speed. If I can hold him up just half a minute, murmured Buck to himself, just half a minute till I get a start, I've got a rabbit's chance of living out the night. From the door of the first shed he took a heavy chain with a key in the padlock. This chain he looped around the post in the main timber of the gate, snapped the padlock, and threw the key into the distance. Then he stepped back and surveyed his work with satisfaction. It would be a pretty job to file through that chain or to knock down those ponderous rails of the fence and make a gap. A smile of satisfaction came on the face of Buck Daniels. Then, hitching at his belt and pulling his sombrero lower over his eyes, he started once more to find Dan Barry. He was more in haste now, for the sun was dipping behind the mountains of the west, and the long shadows moved along the ground with a perceptible speed. When he reached the street, he found a steady drift of people towards O'Brien's barroom. They came by ones and twos and idled in front of the swinging doors or slyly peeked through them and then whispered one to the other. Buck accosted one of those by the door and asked him what was wrong. Well, he's in there, said the other with a broad and excited grin. He's in there, waiting. And when Buck threw the doors wide, he saw, at the farthest end of the deserted barroom, Dan Barry, seated at a table braiding a small horsehair chain. His hat was pushed far back on his head, and he had his back to the door. Certainly he must be quite aware that all Brownsville was waiting, breathless, for his destruction. Now behind the bar stood O'Brien, pale under his bristles, his eyes never leaving the slender figure at the end of the room. But seeing Buck, he called with sudden loudness, "Come in, stranger, come in and have one on the house. There ain't nothing but silence around this place, and it's getting on my nerves." Buck Daniels obeyed the invitation at once, and behind him, stepping softly, some of them entering with their hats in their hands and on tiptoe, came a score of the inhabitants of Brownsville. They lined the bar up and down its length. Not a word was spoken, but every head turned as at a given signal towards the quiet man at the end of the room. Well, folks, It's getting good now, huh? So, if anybody else got a story to tell, let's tell it now, and I'll save the rest of this for next week. Well, and until then, you guys be careful out there. This is Clay Steele.